The drizzle began as a whisper, a fine mist that settled on Arthur's shoulders like a shroud of damp judgment. It clung to the worn fabric of the sofa sitting askew on the lawn, its floral pattern bleeding into a darker, sadder version of itself. Beside it, a mismatched collection of their life. A chipped kitchen table with 3 chairs, boxes sagging with the weight of books and dishes, a floor lamp standing like a lonely sentinel, formed a perimeter of shame around him. This was not a home anymore. It was an exhibition of failure. Across the street, curtains twitched. Faces appeared in the sterile frames of windows, their expressions a blend of pity and morbid curiosity. They were the silent audience to his unraveling, their whispers carrying on the damp air like pollen, invisible but allergenic to the soul. Arthur felt their gazes, 100 tiny needles pricking at the thin armor of his composure. He kept his back to them, focusing on the small, trembling hand tucked inside his own. Leo, his 8-year-old son, stood rigid beside him, his eyes wide and fixed on the 2 men methodically emptying their small apartment. The boy's silence was a weight far heavier than any piece of furniture. Arthur squeezed his hand gently, a small, desperate signal of reassurance he did not feel himself. "It's okay, buddy," he murmured, his voice a rough, low thing. "It's just stuff." But it wasn't just stuff. It was the coffee table Sarah had insisted on buying, the one with a small, circular stain from a mug she'd left there 1,000 times. It was the bookshelf he had built with his own hands, the wood still smelling faintly of sawdust and varnish, a scent that once meant provision and now smelled of inadequacy. Each item deposited on the wet grass was a memory being desecrated, a piece of their history turned into curbside refuse. The men worked with an impersonal efficiency that was its own form of cruelty. They didn't speak to him, didn't meet his eye. He was an obstacle, a ghost haunting the final moments of his own life in this place. One of the men emerged with a cardboard box, holding it carelessly by one of the handholds. The bottom gave way. A cascade of plastic and color spilled onto the muddy ground. Leo's building blocks, his toy soldiers, a small, fuzzy bear missing one eye. Leo let out a choked gasp, a sound of pure heartbreak. Arthur's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He knelt, his bad knee protesting, and began gathering the scattered toys, his large, calloused hands moving with a tenderness that defied the scene. He ignored the snicker from one of the movers. He ignored the silent, watching eyes. In that moment, the world shrank to the size of a small, muddy bear, and his only duty was to rescue it from the indignity of the rain. This was the opening act of his humiliation, played out on the manicured stage of a suburban street where such things were not supposed to happen. He was a cautionary tale whispered over dinner tables, the man who couldn't keep it together. And as he stood, clutching the rescued toys, he felt a profound, chilling certainty that the worst was yet to come. The world had dismissed him, and he had no voice left to argue. A sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb, its tires hissing on the wet asphalt. The door opened and Mr. Sterling emerged, unfolding himself from the leather interior with the unhurried air of a man who owned the very ground he walked on. He wore a tailored suit that repelled the drizzle, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the gray, oppressive sky. He surveyed the scene, the scattered belongings, the silent father and son, the watching neighbors, with a look of profound satisfaction. This was not just business for him, it was theater, and he was the star. "Well, Arthur," he began, his voice carrying easily across the lawn, pitched for the audience behind their windows. "Quite the mess you've made." Arthur said nothing. He simply stood, a shield of stillness around his son. He had already said everything that could be said in letters and phone calls, had pleaded for extensions, for understanding, for a sliver of grace that was never forthcoming. There were no words left, only the raw, exposed fact of his defeat. Sterling seemed to relish his silence. He took a few steps closer, his gaze sweeping over the pathetic collection of furniture with open contempt. 3 months, he announced, his voice rising in volume. 3 months behind. I run a business, not a charity. People need to understand that. There are consequences for not holding up your end of the bargain. He was speaking to the whole street now, justifying his actions, painting Arthur as a freeloader, a leech on the decent, hard-working ecosystem of the neighborhood. The whispers from the windows seemed to quiet, replaced by a more focused, unified judgment. Sterling was a success. Arthur was a failure. The math was simple. "I gave you every chance," Sterling continued, pointing a manicured finger at Arthur. "But you people always have an excuse, don't you? A sob story." "Well, I've heard them all," he gestured vaguely at Arthur's left hand. The one that always had a slight tremor, the one Arthur often kept in his pocket. "Can't work, can't pay." It's the same old song. The public dissection of his private struggles was a new, searing kind of pain. Arthur felt Leo flinch, pressing closer against his leg. He put a protective arm around his son's shoulders, pulling him tight. This was the one thing he couldn't bear, for Leo to see him stripped of his dignity. As if sensing this vulnerability, Sterling's cruelty sharpened. He walked over to a box containing kitchenware and nudged it with his expensive shoe. "You know, Arthur, a real man provides for his family. He doesn't let them end up on the street." The words were designed to break him, to shatter the last fragments of his self-worth. Arthur's eyes, a faded blue, finally met Sterling's. For a fleeting moment, a fire blazed in their depths, a primal anger that made Sterling take an involuntary step back. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, banked and smothered by a will of iron. He would not give this man the satisfaction of a reaction. The final, petty blow came when Sterling spotted the box of Leo's toys that Arthur had just repacked. He strode over, picked it up, and with a theatrical sigh of impatience, tossed it toward the growing pile near the curb. The cardboard was already damp and it landed awkwardly, splitting open again. A small, hand-painted wooden car, a gift from Arthur's late wife, rolled out and struck the leg of the sofa. The tiny wheel snapped off. Leo's breath hitched. Arthur closed his eyes, his control fraying at the edges. He bent down slowly, retrieved the broken toy, and slipped it and the tiny wheel into his pocket. He would fix it. He could always fix things. Just not the one thing that mattered most. The scent of rain on asphalt was inextricably linked to the memory of Sarah. It had been raining the day of the accident, a sudden, violent downpour that had turned the highway into a slick black ribbon of death. He had been at the hospital, his hand wrapped in layers of gauze, a dull, throbbing pain radiating up his arm, when the doctor had come in with a face carved from stone. He hadn't just lost his wife that day. He had lost the master carpenter's touch that had defined him. The nerves in his left hand, crushed in the same wreck that had spared him and taken her, never fully recovered. They left him with a persistent tremor and a weakness that made the fine, detailed work he was known for impossible. He could still build, still repair, but the artistry was gone, replaced by a clumsy imprecision that shamed him. He remembered Sarah's laugh, a sound like wind chimes that could fill their small apartment with light. "You have magic in those hands, Artie," she used to say, tracing the calluses on his palms. After she was gone, the magic had seeped out of him, leaving only the calluses and the ghosts of what his hands could once create. His promise to her, whispered over her still form in a sterile white room, had been simple and absolute. "I'll take care of our boy. I promise." That promise had become the central pillar of his existence. It was why he took the grueling, low-paying jobs that didn't require finesse. Mending fences, hauling debris, patching drywall. It was why he sold his father's antique tools, each one a piece of his own history, feeling a stab of guilt with every transaction. He sold his own wedding band, telling himself it was just a circle of gold, that the real bond was forged in his heart. Last month it had been Sarah's locket. That was the hardest. He had held the small, silver oval in his palm, the metal cool against his skin, and felt like he was selling a part of her soul. Inside was a tiny, faded picture of him and a newborn Leo, Sarah's smile radiant behind the camera's lens. He had pried it open, removed the picture, and sold the silver. The tiny photo now lived in his wallet, a sacred relic. He was a man of quiet principles, principles Sarah had loved. You don't complain. You don't make excuses. You do the work. You treat people with respect, even when they don't deserve it. You keep your word. He had tried to instill these values in Leo, teaching him to look people in the eye, to say please and thank you, to be honest even when it was hard. Now, standing amidst the wreckage of their life, those principles felt like hollow platitudes. What good was integrity when it couldn't keep a roof over his son's head? What good was quiet strength when a man like Sterling could shout it down in the middle of the street? He felt the smooth, broken wood of the toy car in his pocket. Fixing things was his purpose. He had fixed leaky faucets and broken chairs, patched holes in walls and in people's lives whenever he could. But his own life had fractured in a way he couldn't mend. The pieces were too numerous, the damage too deep. Yet, as he looked at Leo, whose small face was a mask of confusion and fear, he knew he couldn't crumble. Not here. Not in front of him. His dignity was the last tool he possessed, the only inheritance he had left to give his son. He would hold onto it with the same fierce grip with which he had once held a chisel, shaping it into a shield to protect the boy from the sharp edges of the world. The eviction crew, their work nearly done, began to move with a finality that was terrifying. The last few boxes were carried out, followed by Leo's small bed frame, its headboard adorned with glow-in-the-dark star stickers. The sight of it, exposed and vulnerable under the gray sky, felt like the ultimate violation. The apartment door, which had been propped open, was shut with a dull, echoing click. A lock turned. The sound was as loud and definitive as a gunshot. They were officially homeless. Mr. Sterling, looking pleased with the efficiency of the operation, pulled out his phone and checked the time. "I'll give you 1 hour," he said, not looking at Arthur but at the pile of belongings. 1 hour to get this trash off my property. After that, I'm calling the county sanitation department. They can haul it to the dump where it belongs. The threat hung in the air, a final, casual twist of the knife. To have their entire life not just displaced, but declared garbage was a new level of degradation. Arthur felt a surge of hot, helpless rage, but he swallowed it down. Arguing would change nothing. It would only provide more entertainment for the onlookers. He had to think. He had to plan. Where would they go? A shelter? The thought made his stomach clench. He pictured Leo on a cot in a crowded, noisy room, surrounded by the desperate and the broken. He couldn't. He wouldn't. Maybe his old truck would run. It had been sitting for weeks, needing a new fuel pump he couldn't afford. They could sleep in there for a night, at least. He started to formulate a plan of triage: clothes first, then the box of important papers, the photo albums. Everything else was just wait. The neighbors remained in their windows, their silence a thick, suffocating blanket. It was a silence of discomfort, of fear that this kind of misfortune might be contagious. No one came out. No one offered a hand, a cup of coffee, a word of support. In their quiet, orderly world, Arthur and his son were a problem they wished would simply disappear. It was this silence, more than Sterling's cruelty, that broke something in Leo. He watched his father, whose shoulders seemed to carry the weight of the entire sky, begin to methodically sort through their possessions, his movements slow and deliberate. He saw the profound loneliness in his father's posture, the way he stood utterly alone against the world. A fierce, desperate love, the kind only a child can feel, surged through him. His dad was a hero. His dad could fix anything. But he couldn't fix this. And no one was helping. In that moment, a desperate, half-formed idea took root in Leo's mind. He had heard the older kids in the neighborhood talking about them. The bikers. The scary men with loud bikes who met at the old auto shop on the edge of town. They were rumored to be dangerous outlaws. But Leo had seen one of them give a lost dog back to its owner once, his tattooed hand surprisingly gentle on the scruff of its neck. They were a power in this town, a different kind of power than Mr. Sterling's money. While Arthur was bent over a box of Sarah's old paperbacks, his back to the street, Leo made his decision. He took a step back, then another, melting into the shadow of a large oak tree on the edge of the lawn. He gave his father one last, determined look. Then, with his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, he turned and ran. He didn't run away from the problem. He ran toward the only solution his 8-year-old mind could conjure. Leo ran with the unthinking, pure-burning fuel of a child's conviction. His small legs pumped, his sneakers slapping against the wet pavement, sending up little sprays of water. He ran past the silent houses with their manicured lawns and judging eyes, leaving the quiet street of his humiliation behind. His lungs burned, and a stitch was forming in his side, but he didn't slow down. The image of his father's face, a mask of weary endurance, was burned into his mind, pushing him onward. He had to get help. He had to find someone who wasn't afraid of Mr. Sterling. The town changed as he ran. The neat suburban homes gave way to older, more weathered buildings, then to a commercial strip of boarded-up storefronts and peeling paint. He was heading for the industrial outskirts, a place his father had told him to avoid. But fear for his dad was a much bigger monster than fear of a strange part of town. Finally, he saw it. An old, corrugated metal garage with a faded sign that read Sully's Auto. Parked in front was a long, formidable line of motorcycles. They gleamed even in the dull light, beasts of chrome and black leather, waiting patiently for their masters. The low thrum of rock music and gruff laughter leaked from the open bay door. Leo's courage faltered for a second. These men were huge, bigger and scarier up close than in the stories. They wore leather vests covered in strange patches. Their arms were covered in ink, and their faces were framed by wild beards and long hair. They looked like Vikings from his history book. He stood at the edge of the parking lot, a small, rain-soaked figure, panting for breath. One of the men, who was polishing a piece of chrome on his bike, noticed him. He nudged the man next to him, and soon, a dozen pairs of eyes were fixed on the boy. The music from inside was cut off. The laughter stopped. Leo swallowed hard, his throat dry. He thought of the broken wooden car in his father's pocket. He thought of the glow-in-the-dark stars on his bed frame, now sitting in the mud. He walked forward. He picked out the biggest man of them all. He was immense, with a beard like a thicket of black wire and eyes that seemed to have seen everything. A patch on his vest read Grizz. He was leaning against a workbench, a wrench in his hand, watching the boys approach with a neutral, unreadable expression. Leo stopped a few feet in front of him, having to crane his neck to look up at the man's face. "Please," Leo began, his voice small but clear, trembling only slightly. "Please, you have to help." Grizz didn't move. He just watched. "Help with what, kid?" His voice was a low rumble, like gravel being poured into a drum. "My dad," Leo said, tears welling in his eyes now that he had finally stopped running. He fought them back, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "A mean man is throwing our stuff out. He's making my dad sad. He's trying to break him." The bikers exchanged glances. This wasn't what they expected. "Where's your dad?" another biker asked. "He's at our house. He's being so strong. He won't even yell," Leo said, his voice cracking with a mix of pride and heartbreak. "But he's all alone, and everyone is just watching." Grizz set the wrench down on the workbench with a heavy clank. He crouched down, bringing himself closer to Leo's eye level. The sheer size of him was still intimidating, but his eyes held a flicker of something other than hardness. "Why come to us, little man?" Leo looked him straight in the eye. "Because you're not scared of anyone," he said, the simple, profound logic of a child. "I don't need you to fight. I just need you to come and see. If you see my dad, you'll understand. He's a good man. Please, just follow me home." The plea was so raw, so full of desperate faith, that it hung in the air of the garage, silencing any thought of refusal. Grizz looked at the boy's earnest, tear-streaked face, at his small, clenched fists, and saw not a nuisance, but a lion cub fighting for his pride. He stood up to his full, towering height and looked around at his brothers. He didn't need to say a word. He just gave a single, decisive nod. Back on the quiet street, Arthur was lost in a small, private ritual of grief. He had found the framed photograph of Sarah, the one that always sat on his nightstand. It had been in a box of fragile items, but in the chaos it had fallen. The glass had shattered into a spiderweb of cracks. He sat on the damp curb, the world shrinking away until all that existed was the silver frame in his hands. He carefully worked the backing off and removed the photograph, a candid shot of Sarah laughing in the sun, her head thrown back, her eyes crinkling at the corners. He set it aside tenderly. Then, with painstaking patience, he began to pick out the shards of broken glass, dropping each tiny, sharp piece into a discarded paper cup. His hands, which had once built houses, were now tasked with this delicate, mournful deconstruction. It was a futile act. The glass was broken. The frame was empty. But the motion was a comfort, a way to impose a small amount of order on an afternoon of pure chaos. It was something he could fix. This quiet, focused act of devotion did not go unnoticed. Across the street, Mrs. Gable, a woman who had only ever given him curt nods, lowered the blinds she had been peeking through. She had seen the movers, heard Mr. Sterling's tirade, and had judged Arthur accordingly. But now she saw something different. She saw a man not defined by his poverty, but by his love. She saw the gentle way his rough hands handled the picture of his late wife, and a pang of shame went through her. "He lost Sarah 2 years ago," she said to her husband, her voice soft. "It was that awful pile-up on the interstate. He was hurt, too. Hasn't been the same since." Her husband, who had been reading the paper, looked up. He remembered Arthur now, remembered him patiently helping him get a stubborn lawnmower started last summer, refusing any payment. The narrative of the deadbeat neighbor was beginning to crumble, replaced by a more complex, more human story. A few doors down, another neighbor, Mr. Henderson, watched from his porch. He remembered seeing Arthur leaving for work before dawn and coming home long after dusk, his face etched with exhaustion. He had assumed the man was just another faceless laborer. But watching him now, sitting on the curb with such profound, quiet sorrow, he saw a father trying to hold his world together with his bare hands. The whispers began to change. The tone shifted from the sharp edge of judgment to the soft murmur of empathy. "That's right, his wife passed. I heard he was a master carpenter before his accident. His boy, Leo, is always so polite." The community had been watching a public shaming. But now, through the lens of Arthur's small, tender action, they were beginning to see a private tragedy. They saw the pile of belongings on the lawn not as a monument to failure, but as the artifacts of a life derailed by fate. The shame that had been Arthur's was slowly, imperceptibly transferring to them. They had stood by and watched, silent and complicit. And in the gray, drizzly afternoon, that silence suddenly felt very cold. The first sound was a low, distant pulse, a vibration felt more in the chest than heard with the ears. It was a sound that didn't belong on this tranquil, suburban street. It grew steadily, a deep-throated growl that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. Heads turned. The neighbors, still watching from their windows, peered down the street, their curiosity piqued. Arthur, still focused on the broken glass, barely registered it at first. But the sound swelled, multiplying, layering itself into a deafening, mechanical roar. It was the sound of thunder on a clear day, the sound of an approaching army. Then they came. One motorcycle, then 2, then 5, turned the corner onto his street, their headlights cutting through the gloom. They were followed by 10 more, then 20. An endless river of chrome and steel and black leather poured into the cul-de-sac, a tidal wave of raw, intimidating power. They were Hell's Angels, a full chapter, moving with the disciplined formation of a cavalry unit. They filled the street from curb to curb, their engines a synchronized, guttural chorus that vibrated through the very foundations of the houses. The air grew thick with the smell of exhaust and hot metal. Mr. Sterling, who had been impatiently pacing by his car, froze, his face a mask of disbelief and fear. The neighbors who had been watching from a safe distance now backed away from their windows, as if the sound itself could shatter the glass. Arthur finally looked up, his brow furrowed in confusion. The sight before him was surreal. A phalanx of the most formidable men he had ever seen, their bikes forming a protective crescent around his ruined lawn, their collective presence a wall between him and the rest of the world. At the head of the procession, the lead rider cut his engine. The sudden, relative silence was jarring. He swung a massive leg over his bike and dismounted. It was Grizz. He was even more immense off the bike, a mountain of a man who moved with a surprising predatory grace. Leo appeared from behind him, running the last few feet to his father's side, his face alight with a triumphant, desperate hope. "I brought them, Dad," he whispered, grabbing Arthur's hand. "I told them you were a good man." Arthur was speechless. He could only stare at the giant biker who was now walking toward him, his heavy boots making no sound on the wet grass. The other bikers remained on their bikes, their engines idling in a low, menacing rumble, their mirrored sunglasses reflecting the scene in 100 fractured images. They were silent, watchful, an honor guard of outlaws. Grizz stopped in front of Arthur, who was still sitting on the curb, the broken frame in his lap. The biker's shadow fell over him. He looked down at Arthur, then at the small photograph of Sarah that lay beside him, then at the boy hiding behind his father's back. His gaze was intense, searching. He wasn't looking at a deadbeat. He was looking at a man. And in that long, silent moment, the entire power dynamic of the afternoon was irrevocably shattered. The street no longer belonged to Mr. Sterling. It belonged to them. Mr. Sterling, recovering from his initial shock, puffed out his chest and marched toward the imposing biker leader. His fear was masked by a blustering, misplaced authority. "I don't know who you think you are," he spat, his voice a reedy contrast to the deep rumble of the engines. "But this is private property. I want you and your gang of thugs off my street right now, or I'm calling the police." Grizz didn't even turn his head. He kept his eyes locked on Arthur, dismissing Sterling as if he were a buzzing insect. He crouched down again, the leather of his pants groaning in protest, bringing himself face to face with the seated man. "Arthur Miller," Grizz said, his voice no longer a growl, but a quiet statement of fact. "You're a hard man to find." Arthur stared, baffled. "Do I know you?" Grizz's lips curved into something that might have been a smile. "Not directly, but I know your work." He gestured with his head toward the street. "My brother Patches, over there," he said, nodding at a grizzled biker with a sergeant's stripes tattooed on his forearm. "He's the quartermaster at the VFW hall down on 5th Street. The puzzle pieces began to click into place in Arthur's mind. The storm last fall. The section of roof that had been ripped away over the main meeting hall. The exorbitant quotes from contractors that the Post, running on donations and goodwill, couldn't possibly afford. "The roof," Arthur whispered. Grizz nodded. "You came in on a Sunday, told Patches you were a vet yourself and you wanted to help. You spent 2 days up there by yourself in the cold. Patched the whole section, reinforced the trusses, retarred the seams. A $10,000 job. Easy." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "When Patches asked you for a bill, you just shook your head and said, 'The Post was there for me when I got back.' Just returning the favor. You never told anyone your name. Just packed up your tools and left." Now another biker, a younger man with a long scar down his cheek, killed his engine and walked over. "That was you?" he asked, his voice full of disbelief and dawning recognition. "Side of the highway, 2 months ago? My chain snapped. You pulled over in that beat-up old truck. Spent an hour with me in the rain, getting my bike running again. You wouldn't take a dime." Said to pass on the kindness, the truth about Arthur, a truth he had never spoken himself, was now being revealed in the testimonies of others. The silent, watching neighbors leaned closer, straining to hear. The man they had dismissed as a failure was being painted as a figure of quiet, almost mythical generosity. A man who gave from an empty pocket, who repaired the world around him while his own was falling apart. Grizz stood and finally turned to face Mr. Sterling, whose face had gone pale. "This man," Grizz said, his voice low and dangerous, "has more honor in his little finger than you have in your entire, worthless life. He's a brother. And we take care of our own." The words echoed in the sudden, profound silence, a declaration of allegiance that was also a verdict. The community and Mr. Sterling were finally seeing the real Arthur Miller. Not the man defined by his eviction, but the man defined by his character. The air crackled with unspoken violence. Grizz took a slow, deliberate step toward Mr. Sterling, who instinctively recoiled. The biker reached into the inside pocket of his leather vest and pulled out a thick, tightly bound roll of cash. He didn't count it. He simply slapped the heavy roll into Sterling's trembling hand. The wad of money was so thick Sterling could barely close his fingers around it. "That's for this month. And the next 6. Grizz stated, his voice flat and cold. "You will write a receipt, and you will give it to me now." Sterling fumbled for a pen, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. "But his lease," he stammered. Grizz's eyes narrowed. "His lease is renewed, indefinitely, at his current rate. Are we clear?" Sterling nodded frantically, scribbling out a receipt on the back of an eviction notice. Grizz took it, glanced at it, and then delivered his final instructions. "Now, listen very carefully. You have 1 hour. You and your men are going to take every single item from this lawn, and you are going to carry it back inside. You will place it exactly where you found it. If so much as a coffee cup is chipped, or a single page of a book is creased, I will hold you personally responsible." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "And then you and I will have a private conversation about respect." The threat was clear, absolute, and terrifyingly believable. Sterling, his face the color of ash, turned and barked orders at his stunned movers. "Get it back inside. All of it. Now, be careful." The movers, who had been watching with wide eyes, scrambled to obey, their previous callousness replaced by a frantic, fearful precision. But the bikers didn't just stand and watch. They began to move as one. Without a word, they dismounted and began helping. These huge, intimidating men, covered in tattoos and road dust, started lifting furniture with a reverence that was staggering. 2 of them carefully lifted the worn sofa, treating it like a priceless antique. Another biker, the one whose chain Arthur had fixed, gently picked up the box of Leo's toys, gathering the pieces that had spilled and placing them back inside as if they were jewels. The sight was transformative. The community, which had been watching from their windows, was now witnessing an act of profound, organized grace. Grizz walked back to Arthur, who was still on the curb, looking utterly overwhelmed. He reached up and, with a solemnity reserved for a sacred rite, he unzipped his own vest. It was a heavy, worn piece of leather, laden with patches that told the story of his life, of miles traveled, of loyalties sworn. He held it for a moment, then gently draped it over Arthur's shoulders. The vest was heavy, smelling of leather, gasoline, and the open road. It swallowed Arthur's slighter frame, but it felt like a suit of armor. "You don't have to be alone anymore, brother," Grizz said quietly. "Welcome to the family." Arthur looked down at the screaming eagle patch on his chest, then up at the circle of bikers working to restore his home, and for the first time that day, his composure broke. A single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of overwhelming, gut-wrenching gratitude. The respect he had never asked for, the protection he never dreamed of, had been given to him, a sacred mantle of brotherhood. The spectacle of the bikers carefully reassembling a broken man's life acted like a powerful solvent, dissolving the fear and apathy that had held the neighborhood captive. The first to break the spell was Mr. Henderson. He walked out of his house, a look of deep shame on his face, and approached one of the bikers who was struggling with the awkward kitchen table. "Here," he said, his voice thick. "Let me help with that." The biker gave him a curt nod of acceptance, and together, they maneuvered the table through the apartment door. That single act broke the dam. A door opened across the street, and Mrs. Gable emerged, carrying a tray with a steaming coffee pot and a stack of mugs. She approached the bikers timidly. "I thought you all might be cold," she offered. Patches, the VFW quartermaster, took a mug with a grateful grunt. "Thank you, ma'am." Soon, others emerged from their homes. They came in a trickle, then a stream. They brought blankets to dry off the damp furniture. They brought cleaning supplies to wipe the mud from the boxes. They brought bags of groceries and hot food. The silent, judgmental audience had transformed into an active, compassionate community, their collective guilt galvanizing them into action. They worked alongside the bikers, a strange and wonderful alliance of suburban families and leather-clad outlaws, all united in a single purpose: to right the wrong they had passively witnessed. Inside the apartment, a quiet, efficient ballet was underway. Furniture was placed, boxes were unpacked, and the small space began to feel like a home again. Leo, his fear completely gone, directed the placement of his bed with the gravity of a field marshal, his small voice piping up. The stars go on the wall by the window. A hulking biker with a skull tattoo carefully re-adhered the glow-in-the-dark stickers, his massive fingers surprisingly nimble. Arthur stood in the middle of it all, the heavy vest still on his shoulders, watching the scene unfold with a sense of dazed wonder. His neighbors, people who had been strangers just an hour before, were now smiling at him, offering him a sandwich, asking him if he needed anything. Mr. Sterling and his crew finished their work and fled, disappearing as quickly and shamefully as they could. The house was whole again. More than whole. It was filled with a warmth and energy it hadn't had in years. As the last box was brought inside, the work was done. The bikers and neighbors stood together on the lawn, a quiet sense of accomplishment settling over them. The rain had stopped, and a sliver of late afternoon sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden light on the scene. Arthur, with Leo by his side, stood on his small porch, the biker vest a symbol of his newfound place in the world. He looked at the faces before him, the bikers who had become his brothers, the neighbors who had become his friends, and felt a sense of belonging so profound it left him breathless. The quiet dignity he had fought so hard to preserve had not just been saved. It had been amplified, broadcast, and returned to him 100-fold. The light began to fade, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The work was finished. The apartment was not just restored, but improved, filled with offerings of food and goodwill from the repentant neighborhood. The bikers began to drift back to their machines, their movements fluid and economical. They had arrived like a storm, and now, their purpose served, they prepared to depart like a receding tide. There were no grand speeches or prolonged farewells. That wasn't their way. Their actions had spoken far louder than any words could. They swung their legs over their bikes, the leather creaking, the metal settling under their weight. Arthur stood on his porch, Leo's hand held tightly in his. He watched them, his heart too full to speak. He wanted to thank them, to somehow express the depth of his gratitude, but he knew that words were inadequate. He simply met Grizz's eyes across the lawn and gave a slow, deep nod. It was a nod that conveyed everything. The understanding, the respect, the unbreakable bond that had been forged in the crucible of that afternoon. Grizz returned the nod, a silent acknowledgement between two men who understood the language of honor. He settled onto his bike, and for a moment, all was quiet. Then he twisted the throttle. The engine of his Harley roared to life, a deep, concussive blast of sound that ripped through the evening calm. In perfect, synchronized response, every other bike followed suit. 30 engines ignited in unison, a deafening, thunderous chorus that shook the very air. It was not a sound of aggression or departure. It was a salute, coronation, a declaration to the entire world that this house, this man, this boy were under their protection. The sound was a promise, a warning, and a celebration all at once. The neighbors stood on their lawns, not with fear, but with a sense of awe. They were witnessing the closing ceremony of a remarkable transformation, their own as much as Arthur's. For a long, heart-stopping minute, the engines roared, a symphony of raw power and loyalty. Then, as one, Grizz and his riders turned their bikes and rolled out, their formation as tight and disciplined as when they had arrived. They rumbled down the street, a procession of guardian angels clad in leather and chrome, their taillights receding like red stars into the twilight. Arthur and Leo watched until the last bike had turned the corner, until the thunder faded to a distant murmur, and then to silence. The quiet that returned was different from the silence that had started the day. It was not empty or oppressive. It was peaceful, filled with the lingering echo of respect. Arthur looked down at his son, whose face was tilted up at him, full of love and pride. He then looked at his small home, no longer a place of failure but a fortress of community. The heavy vest was still on his shoulders, a tangible reminder that he was no longer alone. He had held on to his quiet dignity in his darkest hour, and in doing so had found a brotherhood he never knew he needed, and a community he never knew he had. The motorcycles were gone, but their roar would echo on this street forever.